Hey guys, as we wind down tonight, we drift into a world where the dead still speak not with words, but with strands of hair curled in lockets, woven in wreaths, or braided into tokens worn close to the skin. The past is quieter here, but not silent. It lingers in curls kept in drawers, in jewelry that hums with memory, and in wreaths that still hang where prayers once whispered. You might think a lock of hair is just a sentimental trinket, a soft goodbye clipped at the edge of mourning. But no. In this world, hair was a tether, a sacred relic, a map of love and loss woven together by hands that didn't know how else to hold on. You'll meet mourners who clipped strands from coffins while the priest looked away. You'll hear about nobler women who wore their husband's hair for decades, as if the scent never truly faded. And you'll walk into chapels where entire wreaths of the dead still cling to the walls, more vine than memory, more relic than decoration. It might sound strange. It is strange. But grief makes collectors of us all, doesn't it? So, before you settle in, feel free to give the video a like and hit subscribe if you're truly enjoying the journey. It helps more than you know, especially when the subject is as quietly haunting as this. You can also leave a comment. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. It's always a small wonder to see people tuning in from so many corners of the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that gentle hum in the background. And together, let's ease into tonight's story. You don't start the morning with weeping. You start it with scissors, not the sharp, symmetrical kind that live in modern kitchen drawers. No. Yours are iron, rusted at the hinge, and they creak like they resent being woken from storage. They belonged to your grandmother, or maybe someone before her. The handles smell faintly of oil and something older, possibly soap, possibly sadness. It's not even fully dawn yet. The house is heavy with that specific kind of silence that arrives after someone important has gone. Even the birds seem unsure if they're allowed to sing. You've already lit the small lamp. Its glow doesn't chase away the dark. It just gently reminds the shadows to wait their turn. The body lies still in the front room, wrapped in linen. Someone tied rosemary to the door. You're not sure if it's to protect the soul or to keep nosy neighbours from coming in early and asking unkind questions disguised as concern. You were chosen to take the lock of hair. You didn't ask. But no one ever does. They just look around the room, find the one with the steadiest hands or the fewest tears, and that's the decider. Congratulations. It's you. There is ceremony to this, even if no one tells you the steps. You kneel not out of piety, but because the body is low and you must meet it there. The air smells like beeswax and thyme, and something faintly coppery you try not to think about. The hair is still soft. That's the part you didn't expect. You thought death would change it, stiffen it, dull it, but it's warm from memory, not life, and that makes it worse. You gather a small section, near the nape where it won't show. Everyone says that, as if vanity still matters to the dead. Maybe it does. The scissors protest. They don't want to cut. The metal whines. The blades hesitate. Or maybe your hands do. It doesn't matter. Eventually the hair gives way. A soft snip, like breaking a promise made too late. You place the lock in the pouch. Linen. White. Stitched with trembling fingers. Inside, there's a pinch of dried lavender, a coin, and a single pearl from a necklace that broke the day she coughed up blood. Some say these things help the soul travel lighter. Others say it's just tradition, which is often the same thing with more dust on it. Someone clears their throat behind you. Time to move. The next task waits. Maybe you thought this would be the end of it, a single symbolic gesture. Clip, tuck, done. But no. This is just the first step. You'll be asked if you want it braided, if you want it tied with ribbon, if you want it sealed in glass. You'll be told about locket makers, about charm rings, about wreaths for the chapel wall. You'll nod. You'll say you'll think about it. You won't think about it. You'll carry the pouch in your apron pocket for 3 weeks before realizing it's still there, still warm, still too light. And each time you touch it, the scissors creak again in your memory, like they're waiting to be used again. And they will be. You thought the hard part was over. You thought once the hair was cut and placed safely in its little pouch, your duty was complete. That grief would let you go home, change into something clean, and sit quietly near the fire like people in paintings always seem to do. But no, grief, it turns out, comes with a to-do list, and tonight your task is graveyard watch. They don't call it that, of course. They say you're sitting the vigil, or keeping company with the departed, or, if someone's feeling poetic, guarding the threshold. But the truth is simpler and stranger. You are sitting beside the grave because hair theft is real. You've heard the stories. A cousin's widow long ago whose braid vanished before burial. A grieving father who buried his son with a full head of curls and dug him up again, by mistake a week later, only to find nothing but stubble and wax drips. Someone always wants a piece of someone. And when locks of hair are love tokens, relics, amulets, even currency, the dead don't always get to keep what's theirs. So you sit on a wooden stool that wobbles just enough to make you doubt its loyalty. The night is damp, and the earth beneath your feet is soft in that unsettling way that suggests it hasn't quite settled yet. The lantern beside you hisses as it burns, throwing a cone of golden light that reaches just far enough to make the surrounding darkness feel deliberate. You wrap your shawl tighter, though it doesn't help. The wind has that mildewed chill of root cellars and wet wool, ancient, stubborn, and faintly fungal. It smells like peat and old mushrooms, and something that wants you to know it's there. Behind you, the fresh grave rises just slightly above the others, its mound unshaped, its edges still sharp. You listen. Not because you expect anything, but because the silence demands it. Somewhere nearby, an owl calls long and low, like it's telling a secret you're not meant to hear. A twig snaps, because of course it does. Maybe a fox. Maybe a thief. Maybe the wind practicing drama. You don't move. You hold the pouch in your lap like it might sprout legs and run. You wonder if anyone's ever stolen the hair after it's been cut, after it's been blessed, wrapped, claimed. No one says. But you wouldn't be the first person to find the pouch mysteriously empty in the morning, or open just enough to suggest someone else had a look. Maybe it's superstition. Maybe it's just poorly tied ribbon. Maybe someone really does need it more than you, and still you sit. Because if you leave, and the hair is taken, you'll never be forgiven, not by the family, not by the village, not by the dead. Especially not by the dead. You shift on the stool. It creaks again, louder this time, as if mocking your faith in furniture. You check the pouch. Still there. Still light. Still too quiet. Eventually, the sky starts to grey, that particular kind of grey that feels like regret. And only then do you rise, knees stiff, breath visible, fingers cramped around what you didn't lose. Not yet. You bring the hair home. You do it carefully, like it might spoil if jostled, or worse, unravel. The pouch is tucked beneath your shawl, close to your ribs, where your heartbeat can keep it company. You walk slow, not because of the mud, though there's plenty of that, but because walking fast would feel like rushing through a moment that is already trying to end too quickly. Inside, the house is quiet in that way that says people are breathing nearby, but no one wants to speak first. A kettle simmers on the hearth. No one is drinking tea. The air smells of boiled linen, ash, and something sweet someone forgot to remove from the oven hours ago. Maybe apples. Maybe turnips pretending to be apples. Either way, no one eats. They're waiting for you. Not because you are special, because you're holding something, that is. You sit at the table. The cloth has been changed new, white, stiff with starch, creased in perfect quarters as if grief was something you could iron into order. They bring out the ribbon box. You'd forgotten about the ribbon box, but of course it exists. It always has. It lives in the drawer no one touches, unless someone has just left the world. The box is wooden, round, carved with vines and tiny birds that haven't sung in generations. Inside, spools of thin silk, most faded to shades of almost colour. There's blue so pale it could be mistaken for grey, green that looks like moss in winter, black that's more of a deep tired brown. No one speaks. The decision is yours. You pick the blue. It matches nothing, not even the season, but it feels soft, kind, almost like breath. You begin to tie the lock of hair, just the base, just enough to hold it, and you think, perhaps foolishly, that this will be easy. A knot, a twist, maybe a bow if your fingers remember how. But your fingers don't. They tremble, not with sadness exactly, but with the pressure of doing something permanent with hands that still remember buttering toast. The first knot slips. The second holds, sort of. The third is interrupted by someone bringing over a ring. Gold, thin, dented on one edge, with a pattern worn down to suggestion. It was hers, or his, or both. No one clarifies. The ring is offered like a question you can't answer, and so you take it and slide it gently over the knotted ribbon, where it rests awkwardly, as if unsure it wants to be part of this. You try the bow again. It almost stays. Then one tail droops. You adjust. The other tail droops. You sigh, softly. Someone brings more tea. No one drinks it. In the end, the knot never truly finishes. It's secure, yes, but untidy, imperfect, a little off-center. You think about untying it and starting again, but the idea of undoing it now feels wrong. Like waking someone up just to ask what they dreamt about. So you leave it. You wrap the ribboned hair in a clean scrap of linen, tuck it into a small locket, and snap the clasp shut. It clicks with a finality that echoes louder than it should. There. It's done. Or as done as it ever will be. Now that the hair is tied, wrapped, sealed, and mourned, or at least nodded at respectfully, there's one more question that no one wants to ask out loud. Where do you put it? Not metaphorically. Physically. The pouch is too fragile to carry. The locket is too precious to wear. And the idea of tucking it into a drawer next to spoons and unpaid bills feels, somehow, both disrespectful and vaguely cursed. But you can't just carry it around forever. People will ask questions. Children will find it. Cats will knock it into unreachable corners. At first, you consider the mantle. That seems logical. Important things go on mantles, candlesticks, portraits, things that say, this house has a memory. But then you remember the draft. And the time the cat leapt up during a thunderstorm and took out an entire family of porcelain shepherds. No, not the mantle. Too visible. Too risky. Then someone suggests the hearthstone, just behind the kettle. Warm, stable, near the centre of the home. Except that's where someone once stored a pair of old boots, and now everything vaguely leather smells like stewed onions. So that's out. You look at the wall. Not just any wall, that wall. The one in the back room, where 3 generations of wreaths hang in silence. Made of hair, woven into perfect circles. Some dark, some blonde, some turning grey with age and dust. They are oddly beautiful, tidy, haunting. A little unsettling in that way certain dolls and too friendly paintings can be. Each one labelled with a tiny tag, stitched in thread, bearing names you've heard mostly in whispers. You could add yours, the newest one. The locket could hang from a ribbon, maybe, but you hesitate, because once you put it up there, it becomes something else. Not just memory, but inheritance. A relic. And relics are not for comfort. They are for instruction, for proof. Once the hair is on the wall, it becomes part of the house's judgment. A quiet jury of the gone. So you delay. You place the locket on the table again, watching how the candlelight pools against its brass face. You think about putting it in a drawer just for now. But just for now is the lie grief tells most easily. The drawer becomes a year. The year becomes a box. The box becomes something your descendants find and wonder about, silently accusing you of forgetfulness, even though forgetting is never what happened. Not really. Someone else makes the decision for you, not out of malice, just momentum. The wreath wall has space. The locket is tied with blue, and the blue matches nothing, and so it draws the eye. That night you help climb the stool. You hold the nail steady. You hammer gently, trying not to wake the rest of them. When it's done, you step back. It fits. It doesn't. It always will. It never did. And now it's watching you the way all the others do, not with eyes, but with expectation. You leave the room and close the door behind you, slowly, so the latch doesn't click. And for the first time, you realize you've become the caretaker of a museum no one visits, but everyone eventually joins. The first person to notice the hair isn't family. It's not a neighbor either. It's someone visiting a cousin's friend's niece from the next parish over, the kind of person who arrives carrying a pie rajraing. She doesn't mean anything by it. At least not at first. She's just shown into the back room by accident. No one tells her the wreath wall is there, but she finds it. Everyone does, eventually. It's not hidden. It's just avoided. You hear her voice from the kitchen. Bright. Inquisitive. Too awake for a house that's still remembering how to be quiet. She says something like, "Oh, how lovely are those real?" Which is the wrong question, always. Because the answer is yes, and that makes it worse. You walk in before anyone else can, before your aunt can clear her throat into a warning, or your uncle can drop his cup on purpose to create a diversion. You find her standing in front of the wall, eyes scanning the braided loops, the pinned lockets, the names stitched in crooked thread. Her head tilts the way dogs do when they hear something unfamiliar. She points gently to the new one. "Yours. Is this one recent?" she asks, as if she's complimenting a new curtain or a seasonal wreath. You nod, because speaking feels like it might unravel something you're not prepared to retee. She leans closer. Too close. You notice her perfume something floral and sharp, like violets dipped in vinegar. She remarks how delicate the braid is, how soft the ribbon looks, how she's never seen one quite that colour. Blue, remember, the shade that matched nothing, the one that seemed like breath. You want to tell her to stop looking, or at least to look properly, but instead you just stand there, still as a locket on a nail, while she reaches out and stops just short of touching it. That's when you finally speak, just one word. No, it's not shouted, not even stern, but it works. She retracts her hand as if the hair burned her, as if grief were contagious, and she's just realized her sleeves aren't long enough. She apologizes. Of course she does. People always do when they realize too late they've wandered into someone else's memory barefoot. She laughs, too, softly, the kind of laugh people use to apologize for being alive, when the room still smells faintly of the not alive. You walk her back to the front. She sets down her pie on the table. Rhubarb. Ambitious. You don't mention the hair again. She doesn't either. Later, when the house is quiet again, you go back to the wall. The blue ribbon is still intact. The braid hasn't shifted, but now it feels different. Exposed. Interpreted. Like someone read a private letter over your shoulder and then commented on the handwriting. You consider moving it, hiding it, folding it into a box beneath the floorboards where no curious visitor would think to look. But that would be giving away something you were trusted to hold. So you leave it, for now, for always, for as long as it wants to stay. It's market day. You aren't planning to go, but someone needs onions and someone else claims their shoes no longer understand the concept of soul, and before you know it, your basket is full of requests and your patience is already half spent. You don't wear the mourning locket. Of course not. It stays at home on the wall, where it belongs, where it watches. Still, you carry its weight with you, not literally, but in the way your hand keeps drifting toward the empty spot on your chest, as if the locket might be there after all, as if absence were a new kind of accessory. The market is as it always is, loud, muddy, and scented like a stew that's been left out in the sun. There are shouts in 3 languages, 4 if you count sarcasm, and someone is selling turnips carved into the vague shapes of saints. You pretend not to notice the man shouting about goat leather remedies for heartbreak. It's too soon, and also too ridiculous. You're halfway through haggling for a cabbage when you see it. The ribbon, not your ribbon but close. The same pale blue, soft, frayed at one end, tied around something on a stall at the far edge of the market. A stall that deals in oddments. Trinkets. Things that once meant something but now mean profit. Lockets. Rings. Bits of lace. Bits of hair. Your heart doesn't lurch, that would be too dramatic. Instead, it performs a quiet retreat, a folding in, like a hedgehog. You walk over slowly, not yet allowing yourself to feel panic, because surely it isn't. It can't be. It shouldn't be. But it is. The braid. Yours. Still neatly tied, still soft looking, but now laid out like merchandise, like something anyone with the right coin could take home and pin beside a window and pretend to care. You ask the vendor calmly, too calmly, where they got it. They squint at you like you're a riddle that doesn't rhyme. Came in with a batch, they say. Estate sale. Or donation. You'd be surprised what people let go of. You explain, softly, that it was not let go, that it was not donated, that it belonged to someone who didn't ask to be sold, repurposed, or misplaced. The vendor shrugs, offers to knock a coin off the price, as if that's generous. You don't argue. Not really. You just pick it up, carefully wrap it in the cloth from your basket, the one that was meant for leaks, and leave. You don't pay. He doesn't stop you. You walk the long way home. Avoid the stalls. Avoid the path with the singing fishmonger. Avoid the guilt that walks beside you like a second shadow. At home, you hang the braid back on the wall, but now you hammer the nail deeper. You add a second ribbon. You whisper a quiet apology you can't explain. Then, for the first time in days, you sit, and this time, the chair holds your weight without creaking. You're not superstitious. That's what you tell yourself as you sprinkle salt across the doorstep before bed, as you turn the scissors blade down before putting them away, as you never, absolutely never sleep with your sleep pointed toward the door. You're not superstitious, but the locket hasn't stayed put since it came back from the market. It shifts, subtly, quietly. One day the ribbon is slightly twisted. The next, it's angled a little left. Nothing dramatic, just enough to make you question your memory, or your eyesight, or the laws of how inanimate objects behave. You ask around, gently. You don't want to sound like someone who talks to objects and expects them to respond. But people understand. They always understand, especially if you begin your sentence with, "I don't believe this, of course." But your neighbor tells you it's the wind, even though there are no windows in that room. Your aunt suggests it's just the old wall warping with the seasons, as if grief had a weather cycle. Your cousin says you probably just bumped it, casually, with your elbow or your guilt. But the old woman who sells grave wax and onion poultices at the edge of the village doesn't blink. She says it moves because it wasn't finished. Then she nods, like that explains everything. You don't ask what finished means. You're not sure you want to know. That night you watch it. You sit on the floor in the dim light of a stubby candle, eyes fixed on the braid. The room is so quiet it hums. Time slows down, then folds in on itself like cooling dough. For hours, nothing happens. Of course nothing happens. This isn't a ghost story. This is worse, it's a maybe story. You blink just once. The braid is now facing right, just slightly. Your breath catches. You don't scream. You don't run. You do what every rational person does in such moments. You adjust the ribbon again, more carefully this time, and pretend it never moved. The next morning you salt the floorboards. You light a bundle of rosemary because that's what your grandmother did when the dog barked at corners for no reason. You say a prayer, one of the soft ones that doesn't ask for anything too specific. Just peace. Or quiet. Or at least consistency. You add a second pin to the braid. Then a third. Then you find yourself whispering, "Stay," before you leave the room. You're not superstitious. You just believe in being thorough and cautious, and maybe a little afraid of being wrong in ways that can't be undone. Later, when the locket tilts again, you let it. Maybe it's not trying to leave. Maybe it just wants attention, or acknowledgement, or to remind you that memory is not a fixed position on a wall. Maybe it was never supposed to be still. The wreath maker comes on a Tuesday. You didn't ask her to. She arrives the way certain types of weather do, uninvited, unmistakable, and vaguely damp. She stands at your threshold with a bag that smells like dust and old wood shavings, wrapped in twine and determination. You don't open the door so much as the door opens itself, reacting to her presence like it recognizes authority. She steps in without waiting, without removing her shoes, without saying her name, because she doesn't need to. Everyone knows who the wreath maker is. She doesn't offer condolences. She doesn't compliment the house or comment on the weather. She walks straight to the back room, trailing the scent of beeswax and dry herbs behind her like a robe. You follow, mostly out of politeness, partly out of instinct. The way you follow thunder without thinking. She surveys the wall in silence. Her eyes narrow slightly when they find your locket, not disapproving, just cataloguing. Like she's measuring its story without needing to know the details. Her hands are dry, lined like bark, and they move quickly as she unties her bag. Out come the tools of her craft, a small loom made of ashwood, a narrow-toothed comb, a roll of thread so fine it's nearly invisible. You offer tea. She declines. Not with words. With a glance that says tea is for people who have time to explain things. You ask what she needs. She asks how much you kept. You don't answer at first. You open the drawer, the one with the pouch you couldn't throw away, the one where the rest of the braid still waits, pressed flat between two cloths like a flower never meant for bloom. You hand it to her. She weighs it, literally, in a scale pulled from her coat. Enough for something small, she says, and you wonder if she's talking about the wreath or the mourning itself. She begins. No ceremony, no prayer. Just hands moving with the kind of efficiency that only comes from repetition. Each strand combed, sorted, looped. She hums very softly, and the tune doesn't seem to have a beginning or an end. You try not to watch, but you do. The braid becomes a spiral. The spiral becomes a circle. The circle grows teeth, symmetry, a kind of terrible beauty. It's like watching someone knit a story out of silence. She doesn't ask where it will hang. She already knows. When she finishes, she wraps the wreath in gauze and hands it to you. It's heavier than expected. Not just with weight, with meaning, with history, with the quiet pressure of being something that no longer changes. She doesn't charge. You don't ask why. Some services are ancient enough to operate on rules older than money. She leaves with the same silence she arrived in. You close the door behind her with care, as if sealing a spell. The wreath rests in your lap. Not warm, not cold. Just still. It will go on the wall. Eventually. Not tonight. Tonight, it stays near you, like something living that hasn't quite decided what to do with itself yet. It happens when no one is in the room. That's how these things always happen. You don't witness the moment. You hear it. A soft thud, too muffled to be urgent, too deliberate to be ignored. At first, you think it's the broom slipping from its hook again, or perhaps a mouse with dreams of athletic achievement knocking over the jar of dried sage. But you go to check, because the sound was wrong, not loud, not sharp, but significant. Like someone clearing their throat before starting a sentence that no one wants to hear. The back room is cold. It always is, but today it feels colder, like the chill arrived before you and has been waiting, politely, for your attention. The wreath is on the floor, face down, not broken, not unraveled, just off the wall. The nail still there, the ribbon still looped, everything intact except for the part where it isn't where it's supposed to be. You stand there for too long, staring at it, as if the act of looking might rewind the moment. You crouch, eventually pick it up with both hands like it's an injured bird. The wreath is heavier than you remember, or maybe your arms are just tired, or maybe grief, like hair, thickens over time. You check the wall. The nail is firm. The ribbon hasn't torn. The air doesn't move, but it feels stirred, like someone just stepped out and left the door ajar in a place you can't see. You don't speak, not out loud, not yet. But you feel the sentence forming behind your teeth, the beginning of a question with too many endings. You don't finish it. Instead, you brush the dust from the wreath. You smooth the ribbon. You examine the curve of the braid where it pressed against the floor, leaving an almost imperceptible dent. Then you hold it. You don't rush to hang it again. You sit, wreath in your lap, and wait. There's no logical reason to be afraid. Nothing's broken. No sign of force. No sudden breeze or shifting ground. But your skin prickles anyway, that very particular sensation your grandmother used to call the knowing. as if the room now knows you're paying attention. You try to tell yourself it's slipped. Things slip, ribbons untie, knots loosen, gravity exists, walls shift. All of this is true. All of it is comforting. None of it feels right. Eventually you rise. You don't return the wreath to the same nail. You move it one nail to the right. Just enough to acknowledge that something happened. Just enough to make it look like a choice. You hammer gently. You say nothing. You hang it with both hands. You tie the ribbon tighter, then tuck the end beneath the braid. You step back. It hangs just as it did before. Only now it knows you're watching. The room remains quiet, but the silence is different. It's not empty. It's full like lungs right before the exhale, like a song that hasn't started but already exists. And for the rest of the day, no one goes in that room without knocking. It's dusk when the knock doesn't happen. That's the best way to describe it. A moment where you expect to sound a rap on the door, a footfall on the porch, the scrape of someone adjusting their coat outside, and none of those things arrive. But still something does. A presence. A pause in the air that feels too symmetrical to be natural. It's not silence. It's a placeholder. You're alone. Not in the poetic, self-reflective sense. Literally alone. The fire has dwindled to a red-lidded eye in the hearth. The stew is cold, congealed into a shape that would need to be reclassified as solid. You've done the chores, all of them, twice. Because that's what happens when grief loses its structure. You polish chairs, forget you've done it, and then do it again just in case they noticed. And that's when you feel it. Not on your skin, exactly. More like beneath it. A shift. A ripple. The sense that someone is watching you from a direction that doesn't exist yet. You don't freeze. Freezing feels too dramatic, too theatrical. Instead, you simply stop in the same way a heartbeat pauses between beats. Quiet. Suspended. You walk to the back room because of course you do. That's where it's been leading all day, all week, maybe longer. The door is closed, though you don't remember closing it. The handle is cold. Not forgotten kettle, cold, older, deeper, like the temperature of regret stored in stone. You open it slowly, because haste is for people who believe the outcome changes with speed. Inside, the wreaths are as they were, still, watching, waiting. But the newest one, yours, is different. It hasn't fallen, it hasn't turned, but it's no longer the same shape. The braid, once tight and centered, now leans slightly to the left, its curve gentler, almost like a question mark. The ribbon has loosened, not frayed, just unknotted as if it took a deep breath while you weren't looking. You step forward. You do not speak. You're not afraid. Not exactly. You're attentive. Alert in the way animals are before a storm. Aware that the world is briefly flexible. Then you see it. The thread. Just one. Long. Pale. Floating gently in the air between you and the wreath. Not attached. Not fallen. Just hovering. As if the story you've been trying to preserve has grown impatient and now insists on continuing without your permission. You hold your hand out. The thread lands in your palm, soft as memory, weightless as unfinished conversations. You don't close your hand. You let it sit there, like a small truth waiting to be acknowledged. You know now that the wreath was never meant to be an end. It was an opening. A sentence that began with scissors and is still being written in curls and knots and weightless threads. You just happen to be the one holding the pen for now. And as you step back, the air settles. The room exhales. The silence stops pretending. It becomes a kind of understanding. No one knocked. But something arrived. And it has no intention of leaving. You never think the first Tuesday will be the hard one. Everyone warned you about the funeral, about the first night in the bed alone, the long Sunday when the church echoes too much, the first market without his hand on your basket, the first meal where the silence tastes stronger than the soup. But no one ever warned you about the first quiet weekday when nothing is expected of you and yet everything feels wrong. The door creaks wrong. The bread feels heavier. The laces on your shoes resist tying, as if mourning has somehow crept into the loops. Lady Winifred sits at the window. Not because the view is particularly good, it isn't. It's mostly gravel, a well, and the corner of the stables where the horses continue their lives without concern. But it's the only spot where the light doesn't feel judgmental. She hasn't cried yet. She isn't sure why. The tears seem to be hiding in the thick part of her throat, behind the words she hasn't said and has no one to say them to. The locket lies beside her. It isn't ornate. In fact, it's surprisingly modest for a noblewoman, a small oval of tarnished silver, slightly dented on the back where it once fell from a saddlebag. It had belonged to her husband's grandmother, or maybe it didn't. Family history is rarely as tidy as the servants pretend. What matters is what's inside, a lock of hair, curled and dark, bound with black thread. She tied it herself, the morning after the funeral, with hands that remembered embroidery but forgot how to tremble. She doesn't wear it. Not yet. To wear it would be to declare something not grief but permanence. That he is now a keepsake. That she has become a reliquary. Instead, she opens it. Again. For the 7th time since breakfast, the curl of hair hasn't moved. It never does. But she looks anyway, half expecting it to change. To shift. To shrink. To unravel and spell something she missed when it was still attached to his head. There's a knock at the door. Not the heavy kind, the polite kind. The kind that says, "I know you're grieving, but I also brought paperwork." It's the steward, come with ledgers and soft apologies. He says they can wait, but he doesn't put them down. Winifred nods, says she'll look at them later. The same way she says she'll eat something later. Later is a country grief invents vast, foggy, and mostly uninhabitable. After he leaves, she finally slips the locket's chain over her head. It feels colder than she expects, heavier than it looks. It settles not against her chest, but just above it, hovering slightly like it's not ready to commit. Outside, a horse stamps its foot 3 times. She pretends not to assign it meaning. But she still counts the sounds in her head. 3, not 2, not 4, 3. She breathes in, slowly, carefully, and tells herself that Tuesday will end, that eventually the locket will warm, that the hair will stay curled, that the silence will stop asking questions she isn't ready to answer. But none of these things are certain. Only the weight of the chain is. You think the weight would lessen. That's the assumption. That wearing the same thing every day for 41 years would eventually make it feel like part of you, like a habit or a shadow or the sound your knees make when you stand. But no, the locket never gets lighter. It doesn't hurt, exactly. It just insists. A small, polite anchor hung over your collarbone, reminding you of the day that never fully ended. Lady Winifred wears it every morning. Before slippers, before tea, before acknowledging the weather, the locket is placed around her neck. She no longer checks if the hair inside has shifted. After the first decade, she stopped expecting it to change. But she still opens it sometimes, out of rhythm, when her hands forget they've done it already. It's part of the routine now, like watering the plants that no longer bloom, or setting out a second teacup that no one drinks from. Spring is the cruelest season for mourning. Everything starts to grow again, loudly. The birds return with too much confidence. The air smells like wet soil and stubborn renewal. The locket does not bloom. It sits, indifferent, a curl of hair unbothered by daffodils or warm breezes or neighbours who bring rhubarb in baskets as if fruit could replace conversation. In summer, it sweats with her, not metaphorically. It actually heats under the sun, the silver warming, until it leaves a faint oval of skin memory beneath her collar. People think it's a necklace mark. It isn't. It's history, printed daily. She doesn't mind. She tells them it's better than forgetting. In autumn, the locket feels like part of the wind. She tucks it inside her shawl more often, as if to protect it from the bite in the air, even though she knows it doesn't feel cold. She swears some years that the braid inside seems thicker, darker, more stubborn, like the hair has decided to resist the idea of aging out of grief. And then there is winter, the worst, the longest. Not because of the holidays or the empty chair at dinner or the card from cousins who always forget to address her properly, but because of the static. Everything crackles in winter. Every fire, every sock, every blanket. Even the chain of the locket hums with a kind of quiet electricity, and once, just once, she's sure she felt the hair inside move. Not a twitch. A shift. A settling. As though it had sighed. She doesn't tell anyone. Of course not. What would she say? That her grief rearranged itself like furniture. That the locket had moods. She just keeps wearing it. Through colds. Through court visits. Through boredom and fevers and letters she never answers. When the Queen visited, Lady Winifred wore a sapphire brooch over the locket, but it was still there, beneath silk and ceremony, ticking silently. And every night, when she removes it slowly, like unwinding a very old clock, she lays it down with both hands. Never rushed. Never careless. She still hasn't dropped it. Not once. Because you don't drop the last thing someone gave you, even if they didn't mean to give it. You just keep holding it until it learns to stay. You go because they expect you to go. Because after 3 years and 7 months and yes, you still count society decides that sorrow should have a schedule. Grief, they say, should learn to smile for the sake of conversation. So you put on the dark blue gown, not the black one. Not anymore. Blue is for those who have mourned long enough to look polite in candlelight. You pin your hair with fewer combs than usual. 1 fewer, to be exact. It feels like a betrayal, but also like a relief. You wear the locket, of course, beneath the lace. It never stopped being worn. It just learned to be discreet. The carriage is late. It always is. The wheel squeaks like it's chewing on a regret. You sit on the edge of the seat, not because you're excited, but because leaning back feels like too much commitment to the evening. The driver talks too much. He talks about weather, horses, something about soup. You nod in the appropriate places. He does not ask about the locket. Most people don't. They think it's jewelry. They think it's tradition. They think it's nothing. The ballroom is too warm. The air smells like wine and sugar and shoes. Someone has spilled something by the entrance and everyone steps around it like a polite lie. A string quartet plays a tune, you know, but they're playing it too quickly, as if the violinist is trying to outpace memory. People glance at you, not rudely, not kindly, just glancing, as if you are a painting they recognize but can't quite place. You dance once, with a widower. He smells like soap and boiled meat. His hand is careful on your waist. Too careful, like he's afraid you'll splinter. You talk about pears. Neither of you knows why. It's the safest fruit. There is a silence halfway through the second turn that neither of you bothers to fill. He doesn't ask about the locket. He notices it, though. Everyone does. But no one wants to be the one who wants the wrong question and gets an honest answer. You sit for the rest of the night. Not on the wall, but near it, where the shadows hide the colour of your dress. Someone brings you a drink that tastes like flowers pretending to be brave. You sip it once. Then you forget it's there. Someone new arrives late. A woman in red, with sleeves too wide and opinions that spill out before her name does. She's beautiful in the way that weather can be noticeable, unpredictable, vaguely exhausting. She asks what your locket is. Loudly, publicly. You could lie. You don't. You tell her it's a relic of your husband, of your memory, of your certainty. She blinks once, says, "Oh," and turns away, like she just found a drawer she wasn't supposed to open. You don't leave early. You don't stay late. You leave exactly when you meant to, which is exactly when no one else is looking. You return home, remove the gown, undo the combs, wipe off the borrowed sparkle. You place the locket beside the basin for a moment, and then you put it back on, because some truths are not for parties, but they're still yours. Always. The fever comes on quietly, not with a dramatic collapse, not with chills that rattle your bones like dice in a gambler's palm. It starts instead with a shiver that you dismiss, a dampness at your collar you blame on the weather. You drink broth. You rest. You do all the things one is supposed to do when one is mildly unwell, but the ache grows. First in the knees, then in the back, Then behind the eyes a spreading fog that no fire seems to lift. You still wear the locket. Of course you do. It has never left your body. Not during storms, or travels, or boredom. Illness is no exception. At first it just lies against your skin as it always does, silent, warm, constant. But as your breaths grow shorter and your skin forgets the difference between sweat and chill, you begin to notice it more. The weight, the press, the way the chain leaves a faint impression on your throat when you shift. It doesn't hurt, but it's there, always there, like someone watching over your shoulder who never blinks. The servants whisper outside the door. They're trying not to, but walls are thin, and grief has sharpened your hearing in odd directions. You catch phrases. She's so pale. Should we call for the priest? What if? They don't finish. No one ever does. Someone brings a damp cloth. Someone else changes the linens. You're aware of these things dimly, as if from the bottom of a very old well. The world above continues, but you only catch pieces' footsteps, spoon against bowl, the occasional cough that isn't yours. And through it all, the locket remains. One night or afternoon, or some blur between you dream you are the locket, not holding the memory, but being held, curled, silent, preserved. You dream that someone opens you, peers inside, and nods sadly, as if what they find there was both expected and disappointing. You wake with the sensation that your braid is being tied by invisible hands. You reach up. The chain is cool, unmoved. You want to take it off, just for a moment, just long enough to let your skin breathe. But when your hand reaches the clasp, your fingers hesitate. Not from weakness, from guilt. What if removing it breaks something? What if, after all these years, it is the only thing still holding the pieces of you in place? You leave it. Eventually the fever breaks. Not like a storm, more like a guest who overstays and then slips out at dawn before anyone can blame them. You wake soaked, aching, raw in the joints, but breathing. The light feels real again. The linen smells like something close to clean. A servant gasps when she sees your eyes open and drops a spoon in celebration. You sit up slowly. Your hair sticks to your face. Your hands tremble. The locket, still in place, presses gently against your collar. You smile at it, not because it did anything, not because it saved you, but because it stayed. And sometimes that's enough. You're reaching for a quill. That's all. One small gesture in a day already packed with small gestures, adjusting the hem of your sleeve, refolding a letter that doesn't need refolding, setting the inkpot just a hair to the left because it looked smug where it sat. But this time, the locket snags. The chain catches briefly on the edge of the writing desk, just enough for the tension to tighten, just enough for the smallest sound to click, a snap, a moment of metal giving up, and then silence. You freeze, the kind of stillness that isn't about thinking, but about time collapsing. A pause so sharp it cuts the moment into a before and an after. Before, the chain around your neck, the locket resting against your chest, the familiar pressure like a whisper that never ends. After, nothing but a hollow on your skin, and a faint scuttle of sound as the locket skids across the wood and lands with the softest, most devastating clink on the floor. You don't move right away. There's no panic, just absence. Like the sun stepping behind a cloud with a little too much finality. You look down. It's lying sideways. The lid has sprung open, and for the first time in years, the hair is exposed to the air. Not protected, not contained, just sitting there, a single curl, the memory undone. You pick it up carefully, not like glass breaks. This is worse. This remembers. The chain dangles, limp, useless, like a promise with no clasp. You sit. The room doesn't feel the same. It's quiet, yes, but not comfortably so. The kind of quiet that hovers. A silence that watches you, that takes notes. The fireplace ticks. The ink dries too quickly. The quill you meant to grab now feels foolish, like a spoon brought to a sword fight. You hold the locket in both hands and wonder whether it snapped because of carelessness or timing, or if it simply had enough. Maybe 41 years is the life expectancy of a chain carrying unresolved conversations. Maybe it wasn't a break. Maybe it was a sigh. You try to fix it. Of course you do. You rummage through drawers, not the proper ones, the desperate ones. You find a pin, a ribbon, a twist of copper wire that might once have belonged to a child's toy. None of it works. Nothing wants to be a chain today. Eventually, you tie the locket with a thin strip of cloth. Not elegant, not secure, but sufficient. It rests higher now, closer to your collarbone, slightly off-center. The cloth itches. You let it. Later, someone asks if you're wearing a new necklace. You say yes. Because explaining would take too long. Because loss, once it breaks, doesn't always want to be mended. Sometimes it just wants to be worn differently. And as night falls, you place the snapped chain in a drawer, not because you'll fix it, but because you can't throw it away. You never throw away what held memory together, even if it failed. Especially then. The locket, like all important things, eventually becomes the subject of a conversation. Not a loud one, not even a long one, just a sentence tossed into the air like a feather that doesn't want to land. It begins when someone younger, a niece perhaps, or a goddaughter, someone with polished shoes and the faint scent of lavender powder, leans forward during tea and asks, far too casually, and what will happen to it afterward? You pretend you don't hear it at first. You tilt your teacup, stir nothing with a spoon, glance toward the fire, as though it's saying something interesting. But the question remains, perched between the tea cakes and the lemon slices, quiet as a held breath. You know what she meant. Not what will happen to the object, but to the memory, to the story, to the part of you that lives in silver and silence, and the curl of hair that refuses to turn to dust. You consider telling her it's just a keepsake. You consider saying it's already promised, even though it isn't. You consider laughing. You do none of these things. Instead, you say, I haven't decided, which is true. You haven't. Not because the options are too many, but because they're all wrong. You think about leaving it to someone formally, with ink and signature and legal weight, but every name feels too light, too young, too separate. You think about burying it with you. A final gesture, a full circle, dust with dust and hair with hair. But that seems too dramatic, too conclusive, like sealing a letter you haven't finished writing. You remember what your mother did with her ring, left it in a hollow book, no one found until years after the estate had been packed and sold. You remember your aunt's rosary, hung on a wall, until the string rotted and the beads dropped one by one like the softest rain. You remember too many objects that outlived their meaning. The niece, or maybe cousin, smiles at your answer and nods, as if she understands. She doesn't. Not yet. But you don't hold that against her. Understanding is earned in time and loss and repetition. Later that evening, you take the locket off. Not to clean it, not to polish it, just to hold it. You sit with it in your lap while the kettle boils and the dog sighs, and the fire shifts from flame to whisper. You imagine passing it on wrapped in linen, placed in a box, handed to someone with more curiosity than memory, and you realize it's not the object they'll inherit, it's the responsibility. The strange, gentle duty of remembering something they never saw, the risk of forgetting, the weight of wearing something that doesn't match their grief but still demands respect. You place the locket back on your neck, tie it for now with ribbon again. It rests a little off-center. That feels right. You make no decisions that night, only acknowledgements, that not everything has to be passed on. Some things simply accompany you to the end, quietly, like a companion that never needed a name. You don't mean to leave it out. That's the truth. You had removed the locket the night before carefully, with both hands, as always, and placed it on the folded linen at the edge of the wash basin. The chain coiled neatly, the locket closed, the silver cool against the cloth. It wasn't a mistake. It was a pause, just for the night, just for once. And then morning arrived, carrying too many sounds. Birds that never consulted you before performing their shrill rehearsal outside your shutters. The clatter of someone attempting breakfast downstairs, a maid who believes every egg must be broken with theatrical flair. The kettle, hissing like an old woman with an opinion. You rise later than usual, slower than usual, and when you finally make it to the basin, the locket is not as you left it. It has moved, just slightly shifted an inch, lid ajar, chain now draped toward the side, as if it reached for something in the night. You freeze. The same stillness as when a letter arrives bearing handwriting you recognize but haven't seen in years. It's not fear, not yet. It's suspicion mixed with dread and a pinch of tired curiosity. You glance at the door. Closed. No wind. You glance again at the cloth. Not bunched. No movement. You glance at the locket. Open. The hair exposed. You call for the maid. She appears with the face of someone who expects to be scolded for dusting the wrong vase again. You ask softly, calmly, too calmly if she touched it. She frowns, then says, "It was open when I came in. I just closed the window." No mention of the locket. No suggestion of curiosity. No confession. Just the kind of explanation that makes less sense the more you hear it. You say nothing further, you nod. She leaves. And you sit, again this time beside the basin, with the locket in your lap like a child you aren't sure belongs to you. You run your thumb along the edge. You check the clasp. You stare at the curl of hair that looks exactly as it did yesterday, and yet entirely different, like it knows something you don't. You try to retie the chain. It tangles. You try again. It slips. You tie it with a new ribbon. This one is grey. You didn't mean for it to be grey, but it was the first one you found, and now it seems inevitable. You wear the locket again. Of course you do, but the comfort has changed. It's not betrayal. It's something stranger, like sharing a secret with someone who wasn't meant to hear it. Later that day, you walk through the garden. You don't usually. You pass the thyme bush he once trimmed too aggressively. The bench you repainted after it rained, and he insisted it still needed just one more coat. You stop beneath the tree he planted when you turned 40. It's taller now, wiser, still a little crooked. You touch the locket through your dress. The ribbon tugs, ever so slightly, as if the hair inside has shifted again, settling itself, perhaps after being seen. You find the note folded beneath your sewing box. Not hidden, exactly, just placed. Tucked under the place where you keep the extra buttons you never need, and the tangled bits of thread too short to use but too long to throw away. The handwriting is unfamiliar. Sharp-edged, slightly slanted, with the kind of precision that implies effort, someone trying very hard to make their letters appear composed. It says only one thing. She wore his locket too. You read it once, then again, and again. Each time the words feel less like a sentence, and more like a confession someone meant to whisper, but left in ink instead. You stare at the page as though it might rearrange itself into something more useful, a signature, a date, a context, but no. Just that line, just that truth, or half-truth, or rumour masquerading as fact. You set the note down. You do not tear it up. You do not burn it. You place it beside the locket and look at them together, as if one might explain the other. The idea settles in slowly, like fog filling a room through the keyhole. Someone else wore it, before you, or during, or when it still belonged to his mother, or perhaps when he didn't yet know he would one day be remembered in silver. The possibilities line up like crows on a wall, silent and full of judgment. You try to feel betrayed. You do. You summon the sensation, wait for the heat behind your eyes, the burn in your throat, the familiar ache that grief used to bring to the surface without asking. But it doesn't arrive. Instead, you feel something colder, quieter, more peculiar, like you've just realized that a house you've lived in for years has a room you never noticed, and now you're standing in the doorway, wondering what else was stored there. You don't speak of it, not to anyone. What would you say? That your mourning now has company. That your locket is no longer yours alone, but part of a collection of private griefs handed down like old teaspoons. You keep wearing it. Of course you do. The hair is still his. The chain is still tied with the grey ribbon. The curl inside is still yours, if not in origin, then in meaning. But something changes. You stop opening it. Not out of spite. Not out of fear. Just out of recognition. Because now, when you see it, you see her too. Not her face, not her name, just the echo. The breath before your breath. The hand that clasped the chain before you ever knew it existed. You begin to carry it differently. A little higher. A little looser. As if it is no longer a wound but a song. One with more than one voice. And sometimes, when the wind is quiet and the tea hasn't yet cooled, you touch the ribbon and say softly, not to yourself, not to him, not to her, but to all of it, thank you for sharing. It was meant to be a favour. A gift from a cousin too polite to say you looked pale, too wealthy to say it with words alone. A portrait, she called it, to capture your elegance. You agreed because it seemed easier than refusing, and besides, the painter came highly recommended, known for his ability to immortalize cheekbones and disguise jowls. That was how they phrased it. Immortalize and disguise. Two opposite verbs wearing the same coat. You don't dress up. You don't pin your hair in the elaborate style they suggest. You wear what you always wear, soft, dark layers, sleeves that fall just past the wrist. And of course, the locket. It hangs at its usual place, slightly off-center, suspended from a ribbon the color of overcast skies. The painter notices. Of course he does. Do you always wear it? He asks, while adjusting his canvas. You don't answer. You tilt your head just slightly, which is how you say yes without indulging the conversation. He doesn't ask what's inside. Most people don't. But his eyes flicker there more than once, a glance, a pause, a hesitation in the stroke of charcoal. He sketches quietly for a while, the soft scratch of graphite on parchment filling the room like mice that know better than to be seen. You sit still. Too still. The kind of stillness that only comes from long practice funerals, ceremonies, moments where motion might unravel you. Your back aches. Your fingers twitch. You focus on the scent of the paint, something between vinegar and crushed roses, and the tiny squeak his stool makes each time he leans forward with unearned confidence. He clears his throat. Would you mind? He gestures toward the locket. You blink. He doesn't finish the question. He doesn't have to. He means, would you mind removing it? You say nothing for a long moment. Then you smile, the sort of smile used for disappointing bishops and denying estate managers. Not cruel. Just final. I would, you say. He nods. He doesn't press. But the room changes. The air becomes more aware of itself. The charcoal starts moving again, but the strokes are heavier now, more deliberate, as if the locket has become a problem that must be solved with shadows. He finishes 2 hours later. You rise stiffly. The ribbon has left a faint line against your skin, like memory etched in soft metal. He doesn't show you the portrait, immediately says it must dry, must rest, must be balanced. You nod. You understand. Some things take time to reveal themselves. Weeks later, the portrait arrives. You unroll it slowly, alone, in the room where no one dares dust the bookshelf too loudly. The face is yours, older. Yes, and slightly tired, but unmistakably yours. The background is soft, hazy. The clothes are unremarkable. But the locket is exact, detailed, too detailed. You stare at it, at the way the ribbon frays at the edge, at the tiny silver hinge, at the faint suggestion, almost a whisper of hair inside. He painted it open. You hadn't noticed. But now you wonder, was it? It's a quiet mourning, which is suspicious in itself. The kind of quiet that suggests something has ended or started or changed while you weren't looking. No church bells. No birds. Even the fire hesitates before crackling, like it's waiting for permission. You wake slowly, the way old trees might open their eyes if given the chance. Your joints murmur, your spine recites a few old grievances, and your hands reach instinctively to your collarbone before your thoughts even catch up. The ribbon is there. The locket is not. You sit up too fast. The room spins just once, like a lazy dancer deciding whether to finish the performance. You blink. The ribbon dangles, still tied, still intact, but empty. No weight, no chill of metal, no familiar pressure against your skin that has, for time, become less like jewelry and more like a vertebra. You check the bed, the sheets, the folds of your nightgown. Nothing. And then, just as panic politely begins to knock, you see it. The locket rests on the floor beside your slippers. Upright, closed, clean, Not open, not broken, just not with you. You stare at it. There's no reason for it to be there. No explanation that fits neatly into the drawer labeled daily logic. You remember tying it. You always do. The knot was firm. You remember falling asleep with it nestled in place, a quiet little promise pressed just above your heart. You do not remember taking it off. You lean down, slowly, like you're trying not to wake something. You pick it up. It's cold, colder than the room justifies, and your fingers hesitate around the hinge. You don't open it. Not yet. Instead, you walk to the window. Pull back the curtain. The sky is the soft colour of unspoken thoughts, and the world below is shrouded in that specific kind of fog that seems less like weather and more like forgetting. A servant walks across the yard, basket in hand, unaware of the moment she's not part of. You open the locket. The hair is still there, still curled, still bound with the same thread, faintly fraying at the edge like the hem of a well-worn truth. Nothing has changed, except that it has. You feel it, not in your hands, in your chest, in the space where grief once lived full-time and now only visits on holidays. You close the locket. You do not tie it back around your neck. You walk to the writing desk, the one that's seen too much, and open the smallest drawer. You take the clean handkerchief you never use and wrap the locket inside. Fold it twice. Then place it in the small wooden box where you used to keep letters. You close the lid. You do not lock it. You sit. The chair creaks. The fire finally decides to crackle. The ribbon still hangs around your neck, loose now, purposeless. You could remove it. You don't. You're not saying goodbye. Not exactly. You're just listening to what it says now that it's quiet. You don't notice them at first. That's the trick. That's the brilliance, maybe even the cruelty. The wreaths don't shout. They don't shimmer. They don't arrange themselves in a tidy row like good church icons. They simply exist, faded into the stone, tucked above a niche, curled into shadows where your eyes were trained not to look. It isn't until you step back, or tilt your head, or glance upward during a particularly unconvincing hymn that you realize the walls are not bare. Not really. They're woven. The chapel in Bergen isn't large. It's a place meant for quiet prayers and damp shoes. The ceiling slopes just enough to make tall men duck instinctively. The benches are uneven. The scent is a blend of old wax, damp wool, and a faint tang of mildew that no priest has ever successfully prayed away. You sit near the back, not because you're irreligious, but because back rows are where grief feels less self-conscious. And then you see it. At first you think it's a vine, something natural, something botanical. But vines don't form perfect ovals. They don't frame nothing in such careful symmetry. You squint, you lean, and then the truth steps into view. Hair, twisted, braided, curled, formed into loops and spirals and floral shapes that almost look like ivy or laurel or dried reeds, if you didn't know what human hair looks like when it refuses to decay politely. It's not one wreath. It's many. Some small, some grand, some arranged like halos, some hanging like the letter O waiting for a name. You don't react. You just blink. Because what do you do when the wall itself is remembering? The wreaths don't have names attached. No plaques. No dates. Just the silent insistence of presence. Someone made these. Someone climbed a ladder, or stood on a chair, or stretched on tiptoe to hang these soft, stubborn shapes. They must have done it gently. You don't pin something like that in anger. You fasten it like you're tucking in a child who's already asleep. You ask the woman beside you, she's older, with a coat that smells like carrots and a voice that sounds like it's used to not being heard, and she nods with assent. Wreaths, she says, like that's enough. Been here since I was small. Then she adds, they used to add more. Used to. You glance at the walls again. There's space. There's always space, but none are new. No fresh strands. No fresh sorrow. You wonder who stopped the tradition. Who decided there were enough? Or maybe, who decided that seeing your ancestors' grief pinned above you like decorative gilt was no longer comforting. When the sermon ends, no one looks up. Everyone files out as if the walls are blank. as if the ceiling didn't grow heavy with memory, as if hair weren't the most patient form of testimony ever woven into architecture. You remain seated, just for a moment. You tell yourself you're resting your legs, that the draft is stronger near the exit, that the priest's benediction was too long. But the truth is, you can't stop looking. And you're starting to count. She doesn't wear a uniform, but you know she's in charge. There's a firmness to the way she carries the ring of keys, not jingly, not performative, just quiet, decisive weight. She moves like someone who once organized an entire drawer of mismatched silverware and refused to be defeated by forks that thought they were special. She asks if you're here for the tour. You say no. She nods anyway and unlocks the side door. It sticks. Of course it does. Old wood has a way of objecting to change, but she leans into it, hip and shoulder working together in alliance forged by years of resistance, and the door gives in with a sigh. The room beyond is colder. Not because it's stone, though it is. Not because it's underground, though it isn't. But because the air has been trained to behave. The light is filtered through one thick window, warped glass that makes the world outside look slightly guilty. You follow her in, footsteps muffled by a floor that's not dirt, but not entirely finished either. This is where we kept them, she says. That means the wreaths, the ones not yet hung, the ones awaiting repair, the ones sent from far-off places by people too heartbroken or too shy to bring them themselves. You look around. Shelves line the walls, not in straight lines but in the hesitant, lopsided arrangement of furniture moved by people who disagreed on placement and gave up halfway through the argument. Each shelf holds boxes. Each box is labelled. Each label is wrong, or at least unhelpful. Words like blue thread or cousins, or unclaimed 1874. She opens one. Inside, hair, not just a curl but a braid, thick, dark, bound at one end, loose at the other, as though it still expects to be brushed. You don't say anything, because what is there to say? It's not eerie. It's not gruesome. It's kind. Sad in the way old mittens are sad, full of warmth, with no more hands to hold. She closes the box, opens another. This one holds a small wreath, delicate as a question. Pale strands coiled around a wire frame, with tiny paper roses glued in the glue browned. The roses slumping, as if they've lost the strength to pretend. There's a method, she says, gesturing to a table covered in tools. Tiny combs. Hooks. Tweezers. A small bottle of something labelled only binding spirit. People used to train for it. Not everyone could braid memory. You nod, though your throat feels tight. You don't touch anything. It would feel like interrupting a conversation you were never meant to hear. She doesn't offer you one to take. She doesn't suggest donation. She doesn't ask whose hair you might carry. She just watches you absorb the room. And before you leave, she says, not loudly, not kindly, just evenly, we don't hang them anymore. But we don't throw them away either. That would be wasteful. You thank her. And when the door shuts behind you, it sounds more like a page turning than a lock clicking. It happens while you are leaving. Not dramatically, no sudden revelation, no gasp, no ghostly breeze that flips your collar and changes your destiny. You're just walking past the vestibule, pausing out of habit to adjust your scarf when something drifts downward. Small, pale, floating in that aimless way that things do when they're both weightless and full of meaning. You catch it mid-air without thinking, and it takes a moment before you realize what it is. A strand of hair, not yours, not grey, not dark, not even curled in a memory-shaped loop. Just a straight, fine strand of light, brown no longer than a wish, and soft enough to confuse your fingertips. You look up. There's no one near you. No coat above. No hat to shed. The door behind you is already closed, with the deliberate hush of something that prefers not to explain itself. You hold it for a moment, not with reverence, not with fear, just with that strange, slow attention that only shows up when a detail refuses to be ordinary. You could drop it. Let it drift again. Let it find some corner of the chapel where old air gathers like quiet gossip. But instead, you walk back toward the vestibule table, the one holding spare hymnals, and the ball of mismatched buttons someone once called charity, and you place the strand on the wood. Just there, no ceremony, no message, and you walk away. But hours later, when the train rattles you back to wherever your bed waits, and the sky turns the colour of a forgetting bruise, you think about it again. That hair, that moment, that pause in the middle of everything, so thin it nearly disappeared. You wonder if someone else will find it. Someone who won't know it wasn't supposed to be there. Someone who will think it came from the past, and will therefore treat it like a relic. Someone who might pick it up and whisper a name they never said aloud until then. You wonder what it means to become part of something you didn't plan to join. Whether grief collects people the way moss collects stones, slowly, gently, without permission. At home, you sit with your coat still on, hands in your lap, eyes not really seeing the room. You touch your own hair, pull a strand, hold it up to the light. It glints, but it doesn't answer. And for the first time in months, you reach for the locket again. You open it, slowly. The curl is still there, still silent, still his. You close it, not out of finality, out of understanding, because now you know. Hair is never just hair. It's a timeline, a witness, a thread you didn't mean to follow, but now that you have, it will tug at you, quietly, forever, like a memory you never actually made, but still recognize. The book is older than it looks, but not by much. Its spine is cracked, though someone has tried to mend it with a strip of linen and an unusually ambitious amount of glue. You find it on a shelf that doesn't want to be browsed, in a library that smells like someone's cellar and someone else's regrets. You didn't mean to find it. That's the rule with objects like this. They arrive when you've stopped looking, when you're wandering through an unrelated aisle in search of a dictionary or a quiet seat by a drafty window. It's titled Forms of Sentiment in the Braided Tradition, which sounds, frankly, like something no one has ever read willingly, but your hands reach for it anyway. The pages inside are yellowed, brittle at the corners, as though time has been nibbling them politely. You open to the first chapter and are greeted not by preface or dedication, but by a diagram, a spiral, hand-drawn, ink smudged, labelled in a looping script, pattern for grief, single subject. You don't know what that means yet, but the next page helps. There are instructions, not poetic suggestions, not philosophical musings. Instructions, step by step, how to clean the hair, how to boil water with lavender to soften the strands, how to measure for framing, how many twists per inch, depending on age, how to bind without damaging the memory, how to secure the ends with wax that doesn't smell like anything at all. You keep reading. There's a chapter on shared lost 2 strands, sometimes 3, braided with care into wreaths that cross and recross, forming shapes that suggest unity, but also stubbornness. There are notes in the margins, some in English, some not. One simply says, "Don't start at the center. It will unravel everything." You stop there. You close the book gently, the way you'd close a sleeping child's eyelids with your palm. You stare at the spine again. Someone tried to keep this together. Someone who thought that preserving instructions meant preserving the people who once followed them. You carry the book to the front desk. The librarian doesn't even blink. She just stamps the card, slides it across the counter, and says, 3 weeks, as if you borrowed a novel about ducks. At home, you don't read further, not yet. Instead, you place the book beside the locket, and the old hairbrush you haven't used in years, and the clipping you once thought about sending to someone but didn't. You light a candle, not out of ritual, but because the room needed something. You run your fingers along the edge of the cover. You don't open it again that night, but you whisper, not the center. Not the center, like a reminder to yourself, to time, to the ghosts of all the fingers that once braided grief into shapes they hoped would hold. You fall asleep with that phrase circling gently, a mantra made of caution and thread and hair. She's just a name in the ledger at first. Scribbled, not written, the kind of entry added by someone who didn't expect anyone to read it twice. Elsbeth, age 14. Took up study. Left unfinished. No date. No location. Just that. You find it in the back pages of the book you borrowed, the one with the diagrams and warnings about not starting in the center. It's tucked behind the last page like a footnote someone forgot to erase. You don't know why it lingers with you. Maybe because 14 is young for anything, let alone braiding the hair of strangers into wreaths that stare back at you with unblinking sentiment. Or maybe because left unfinished feels too much like a judgment passed by time. You start noticing her absence in places she should be. There's a gap in the instruction diagrams. Page 43 skips to 46. You go back and forth, fingers skimming brittle edges, and they're simply missing. Torn out cleanly, deliberately. There's a dark smudge in the index where he should be. Someone tried to erase her from the record and did a poor job of it, like wiping away chalk with a wet sleeve. You begin imagining her. Not out of romance, just curiosity. She would have started on practice strands, clipped horsehair, perhaps, or fibers from wigs no longer attached to performances. She would have sat at the back of the workshop, small hands awkward at first, watched by a mentor with chalk on her sleeves and a pincushion that looked like it had opinions. She would have cried, probably. Everyone cried at some point. Grief was part of the learning. You couldn't weave mourning without catching some of it under your nails. You imagine her trying, failing, trying again, creating loops that collapsed, spirals that refused to stay shaped, a mess of soft strands refusing to behave, as if the memory inside them rejected her fingers. And then you imagine her stopping, not because she couldn't do it, because something in her realized she shouldn't. That not every hand is meant to hold the past, that some people are meant to mourn by forgetting, not by weaving it into wreaths that never quite gather dust. Maybe she returned her apron. Maybe she simply didn't show up one morning and no one asked. Maybe her half-finished wreath sits somewhere, quiet and slightly tangled, still waiting for a final twist that will never come. You check the box of unclaimed pieces the next time you visit. You don't find anything labelled Elsbeth, but you find one wreath that doesn't match the others. Smaller, messy, strands escaping in odd directions, like they were trying to form words in a language no one speaks anymore. The label simply says, unknown, left during flood. It's not beautiful, it's not complete, but it's honest. You don't touch it, you don't need to, you just nod, and say softly to the empty room it's all right. You didn't have to finish. And somehow, that feels like the final braid. She doesn't call herself a curator. She says she just keeps it tidy. Her name is Agneth, and she wears 2 aprons, one to protect her skirt from the dust, and one to protect the first apron from whatever the dust missed. She meets you at the chapel not with ceremony, but with a long sigh, the kind that's been aging inside someone's lungs for years, and finally found an appropriate moment to exit. You hadn't asked for a guide, but she arrives with keys anyway. You want to see the wreaths? She asks, already turning the knob. You nod. She opens the door like it's been misbehaving. The air inside is heavier than you remember. Not musty, no, it's cleaner than most places you've prayed in, but still, it's thick, as if the room had taken on the weight of all the things no one has dared to say aloud since the last hair was pinned. Agnetha pulls a cloth from her belt linen, folded twice, with the corners stitched in blue thread, and begins dusting the shelves with the slow, precise gestures of someone who has never forgotten a single object's name. She doesn't speak at first. You walk slowly behind her, careful not to breathe too deeply. People think these are decorations, she says eventually. They're not. You agree, but she doesn't wait for agreement. They ask why we don't clean them. I say, because they're clean already. They're just old. And then they nod, and you can tell they don't understand anything. You ask if she's ever made one herself. She pauses, dusts the edge of a frame, flicks her wrist. No, she says. Too much meaning. I'd get it wrong. You ask how she cleans them, if not with cloth. Oh no, she says. You don't touch them. You dust around them. Like they're sleeping cats that might wake up and ask you personal questions. You laugh. She doesn't. She points to one wreath in the corner. That one tried to fall once. Wind blew through the window and caught the edge. Gave me a fright. I put a little brace behind it. Toothpick, mostly. Don't tell the others. You ask if she's ever thought about taking one home. She blinks, looks at you like you just suggested renting the moon. These don't belong in homes, she says. They're not souvenirs. They're fragments. You don't decorate with fragments. She tells you they rotate them sometimes. Not publicly. Quietly. At night. So the light doesn't fade just one side. They all deserve even wear, she says. As if memory, like furniture, might rot unevenly if not turned with care. You thank her. She shrugs. They thank themselves. And before you leave, she straightens one lopsided frame. The hair inside is curled into a kind of question mark. You ask if it was meant to be that shape. She tilts her head. Depends who's asking, she says, and leaves the mark exactly where it is. You wouldn't have recognized it as different if she hadn't pointed it out. The frame is the same as the other's oval, wooden, slightly bowed with time. The wreath inside is tight, neatly braided, coiled like a polite snail trying not to draw attention. But the ribbon is pink. Not pale rose. Not the washed-out blush of a funeral flower 3 days past its prime. Proper, assertive pink. Still vivid. Still clinging to a stubborn optimism that the rest of the wall has politely agreed to ignore. Wedding wreath, Agnetha says, with the tone of someone introducing an unexpected guest at a wake. They made them sometimes. Same method. Different intent. You blink. You weren't prepared for joy in this place. You look again, trying to see it differently. The braid is delicate, yes, finer than most, and shaped not in an oval or a teardrop, but in a gentle heart. Not a cartoonish one. Something quieter. The kind of heart shape someone would draw while thinking of someone they missed, not someone they loved. The label below it is new, printed, not handwritten. Hildegard Johann, 1842. Joined. That's it. No surname, no date of death. Just one word, joined. You ask if they died young. Agneth shakes her head. Lived ages. Still got grandchildren in town, but the wreath went up early. Made from her braid and a strand he saved from the comb. You ask why it's here. Agneth shrugs. Donated after she passed. He said he didn't want to keep it in a drawer. Said it wasn't his to own anymore. You think about that for a long time. The idea that love might be too big to store, that it needs walls, even cold ones, to lean against. That memory, when content still doesn't like to be confined. You look closer. The pink ribbon is frayed. Not from neglect from being touched. People must have tried to straighten it, or brush dust from it, or just lingered near it, the way people do when they're looking for proof that love, once witnessed, doesn't fade completely. You reach out not to touch it, just to hover near it, and you imagine Hildegard's hair being braided, perhaps on a morning when Johann was trimming candles, when the soup was already simmering, and the light coming through the window made everything look forgivable. You ask if others ever bring wedding wreaths now. Agneth smiles for the first time. A small smile, barely there. They do. Not often. But sometimes someone shows up with a shoebox and a folded letter. Always folded. Never sealed. You think you understand, because what you're looking at isn't joy preserved. It's joy acknowledged. Joy that admits it didn't last forever, but still mattered enough to hang. Not as a warning. Not even as a remembrance. Just as a shared breath, pinned in place. And somehow, that's harder to look away from than any of the wreaths shaped by grief. It takes a few visits before you notice the pattern. The chapel walls feel random at first, wreaths above arches, in corners behind candlesticks, some higher than eye level, others almost at reach. You think maybe it's aesthetic. Maybe someone placed them where shadows wouldn't fall. Maybe the decisions were made by height, or nail availability, or whatever whim struck the caretaker that day. But then you start to see it. Not with certainty, more like sensing a tune in the background and realizing you've been humming, a certain spacing, a way the larger wreaths tend to anchor the far wall. The smaller ones cluster near the window. Wedding wreaths, the rare ones, drift toward the southern edge, near the cracked column with moss growing in its base. Children's wreaths tight, faint, sometimes barely a curl looped twice stay low, at knee height, as though no one had the heart to hang them higher. You don't ask about it, not right away. You try instead to test the pattern. You sketch the room on a folded napkin, mark the positions, play with arrows like a general planning a slow war against silence. Nothing clear appears. Not a name, not a symbol, but it doesn't feel random anymore. You finally ask Agneth. She's cleaning wax off the stone floor with a patience you don't dare interrupt lightly. She squints at your map, then tilts her head. Some say there's meaning, she says. Others say it's just where nails were hammered by tired hands. She rubs at a stubborn bit of wax. But I think maybe it's a bit of both. You press. Was there ever a list? A ledger? A plan? She laughs, not at you at the idea. No list. Just choices. One at a time. Like laying out a long sentence you don't know the grammar for. That stays with you. Later, alone again, you begin to walk the perimeter with deliberate slowness. Not to count, but to listen. To feel whether the wreaths speak differently depending on where they hang. Whether joy sounds softer in the south or in the south corner. Whether grief huddles near the dark beam by the door. You don't get answers, but you get a feeling like reading a language you don't speak fluently, but can somehow still understand. There's one wreath mid-sized, slightly crooked, pinned with a rusted hook that seems barely capable of holding it, that draws your attention more than it should. It's unremarkable in material. The braid is standard, the pattern conservative, but its placement bothers you. It interrupts the spacing, breaks the visual rhythm like a single sharp note in a lullaby. You ask no one. You don't point it out. But before you leave that evening, you find yourself shifting slightly to stand in front of it, not blocking it, not correcting it, just acknowledging its interruption. Sometimes placement is the story. Sometimes the only map left is the one you're standing in. She isn't from here that much is obvious from the moment she enters. Her shoes are too clean. Her coat too red. Her gaze doesn't rest, it scans. She walks the chapel like it's a museum, and maybe, in a way, it is. But the people from Bergen don't walk it like that. They shuffle. They pause. They look at the floor between glances, as if making too much eye contact with memory might wake something best left asleep. You happen to be sitting on the bench under the western sill, the one where the window doesn't quite shut and the wind insists on telling you things you didn't ask to hear. You're not watching her, not directly, but her movement interrupts the room. She counts, you realize. Not just observes, counts. She lifts her hand subtly. One finger for each wreath. Tap, tap, tap. You wonder what she's looking for. A pattern, a total, a record to match against something she's brought with her, folded in that leather notebook she keeps checking like it contains a treasure map written by ghosts with poor penance. After a while, she kneels beside the wall where the children's wreaths are kept. She doesn't touch them. She just stays there, longer than expected. When she finally rises, she flips a page in her book and jots something down with a pen that clicks too loudly in the silence. Then she says it. There's one too many. She says it not as accusation, but as math, as if memory should come with a receipt. Agneth hears her from the far end of the room. She doesn't rush. She walks over with a calm that smells faintly of floor wax and fatigue. The visitor shows her the page. The numbers. The discrepancy. Agnetha doesn't even glance at the wreaths. She looks at the woman and says, "There are never too many." The woman hesitates. Points again. Says something about records, previous counts, donation logs, confirmed hangings. Agnetha repeats it. There are never too many. And then, softer, almost like a secret she doesn't want the walls to overhear. Memory doesn't do subtraction. The woman nods, eventually. Not because she agrees, but because she understands she won't win the argument. She closes her notebook, tucks it away, and leaves without finishing her count. You remain seated. Later, when the light has changed golden now, long and slow and filled with the sighs of things preparing to be forgotten again, you look at the wreaths and try to see which one was the mistake. Which one doesn't belong? Which one was added without permission? Or without a name? Or perhaps without a death? You can't find it. And slowly, it occurs to you that this is the point. That some griefs sneak in after the lists are made. That not every memory is on the guest list, but some show up anyway, wearing borrowed coats and silence like perfume, and no one turns them away. You hadn't planned to be there after dark. No one does. The chapel is not technically closed at night, but neither is it exactly open. It enters a kind of pause, a stillness not enforced by locks, but by mutual agreement. People simply leave. Even Agneth, who once said she trusted the wreaths more than she trusted clocks, folds up her apron and goes home before the candles reach their halfway mark. But tonight you linger. Not because you're searching, not because you're sad, just because sitting still felt easier than walking away. The light changes in increments too slow to measure. The windows stop catching reflections. The walls stop offering shapes. The room softens, like a photograph losing focus, one grain at a time. You don't move. Your knees ache from the bench, your hands stay folded in your lap, and the locket forgotten in your coat pocket for weeks now somehow finds its way into your fingers again, though you don't remember retrieving it. It is in this near silence, this velvet hush between candle drips, that something shifts. It's not sound exactly, not movement either, more like presence. A subtle rearrangement of attention in the room, as if the wreaths, the whole wall of them, have turned slightly in their frames, not physically, but spiritually, as if the collective weight of memory had tilted, ever so slightly, to glance in your direction. You tell yourself it's just the light, that the single remaining candle has burned low enough to cast strange shadows. That memory does not notice people. That mourning doesn't blink, but you can't quite unfeel it. You look around slowly. Nothing moves. The wreaths remain as they've always been, stoic, twisted, quiet. And yet, there is a sensation, like being observed by something gentle, but extremely old. Not judging, just remembering harder than you can. You stand, stretch your legs carefully. You step to the far corner, the one you've avoided until now, and you let your fingers drift a hand's length from the frame nearest the ground. You don't touch. You just hover. And you say, "I'm still here," softly, not because anyone needs to know, but because you need to hear it spoken. A breath of air answers. Cold, brief. It might be the window. It might be nothing. You return to your seat. The candle expires with a tiny cough of smoke, and now the darkness settles in like an old coat, not hostile, not hungry, just worn. You do not rush to leave. You wait until your eyes adjust, until your body stops announcing its discomfort, until the room becomes a companion rather than a container. Then, quietly, you place the locket back into your coat. And as you stand, you whisper one last sentence, one you don't remember planning, but which leaves your lips like it's been waiting all day. Thank you for keeping them. You do not clarify who them means. Neither do the wreaths. It looked like a plain ring. Simple. Modest. Unremarkable, even. The sort of thing one might expect from a man whose face was always tilted toward the throne, whose back seemed permanently bent by the weight of etiquette. You wouldn't notice it in passing, not unless you were staring at his hands, and even then, you'd probably assume it was iron, or tarnished silver, or some other humble metal chosen for its invisibility. But then you'd catch the light, that odd, oily shimmer, not quite reflective, not quite matte. And you'd realize it wasn't metal at all. It was hair, braided, dark, threaded with care, not encased, not hidden. The entire ring was the braid tight, deliberate, formed with such precision it seemed to defy the softness of its source. No embellishments, no gems. Just memory, wrapped around a finger worn thin from clenching scrolls and sealing letters with wax that always cracked too soon. He never mentioned it. Not once. In a court where every accessory whispered something, a brooch might imply alliance, a chain might warn of debt, a feather might flutter with scandal, his ring said nothing, which, of course, made it say everything. Some speculated it was his wife's, others thought a son, or brother, or lover exiled for reasons no one dared ask. A few believed it wasn't personal at all, that it belonged to a fallen comrade, or a queen long dead, and that he wore it as insurance against forgetting. But the truth was simpler. It was his sister's. She died when he was 17. A fever that burned fast, left no time for ceremony. He had cut her hair himself, trembling, awkward, and kept the braid in a drawer for years. Then one winter, after a diplomatic dinner where a visiting baron accused him of sentimentality, he commissioned the ring out of spite. Quiet, furious spite. He wore it every day afterward, even to royal baptisms, even to coronations. Even when laws were passed banning unregistered jewellery at court functions, a ridiculous rule meant to crack down on subversive symbols, he filed a petition for exemption. It was denied. He wore it anyway. One day, during an especially long council session about grain taxes, the king noticed. He reached for the minister's hand, examining the ring without asking. The chamber fell into the kind of silence normally reserved for bad weather and whispered assassinations. The king turned the ring slightly, squinted, and said, "Hers?" The minister didn't blink. "Yes." The king nodded. "Good." That was the last word ever spoken about it, but for years afterward more appeared, quietly, in pockets, in brooches, on chains hidden beneath collars. Hair, not shouted but shown, proof that memory could be worn not merely as ornament, but as declaration, as resistance. As legacy coiled into a circle, you saw his hand once. He didn't notice you looking, but the ring did. You weren't supposed to notice it. That was the point of court jewellery, to shimmer just enough to be seen, but not enough to be questioned. And yet, there it was, pinned just off centre on Lady Enid's bodice, where the light hit it too often to be unintentional. At a glance, it looked like enamel, or finely tooled bronze, but the texture betrayed it. Woven. Tight. Threads not of silk or gold, but hair auburn, slightly frayed at the edge, like it remembered wind. You watched her fingers graze it 3 times during the dinner, not nervously, not fondly either, like someone checking a pulse on something not quite dead. You asked about it later indirectly, through the language of court politeness, which involves a lot of admiration wrapped in questions that are mostly apologies. "Such an unusual material," you said. "It catches the candlelight so interestingly." She smiled. "Doesn't it?" she replied, in the tone of a woman daring you to continue. You didn't. Not immediately. But 2 days later you heard the story. Not from her. From her steward, who had won too many cups of spiced cider and forgot which rumours were meant to stay folded. The brooch had teeth. Not literal ones, but the kind that left marks. It had been made from the hair of her first husband. He died dramatically, a duel, a letter, a mistaken appointment. No one quite agreed, but everyone agreed she had grieved, performatively. She wore black for a month, then lilac for a week, and then commissioned the brooch, so he could still attend state dinners, she supposedly said. The hair was set in a circle, pressed into a pattern of twisting thorns, with a single pearl at the centre, not as a symbol of purity, but because she said the jeweller owed her one, and had nothing else that day. At first it behaved, but over the years it developed a reputation. People claimed it heated unexpectedly, or left smudges on lace collars. One maid refused to polish it, saying it hummed when held too long. A bishop, after offering an unsolicited remark about the propriety of hair jewellery in public, found a rash blooming across the side of his neck, exactly where she'd brushed him in passing. Of course, it's all nonsense. Except you saw her touch it again, once more, during a particularly tedious toast about royal aqueduct reforms. Her fingers rested on the edge of the brooch, gentle, almost affectionate, and the host dropped his windglass a moment later. No reason. Just a slip. Just a coincidence. You've never worn hair jewellery yourself. It seems heavy. Not in weight, but in implication. To wear someone else requires a kind of certainty not about them, but about yourself. That you can carry them. That you won't turn the memory into something too sharp. You passed Lady Enid later that evening. She looked at you, just once. The brooch caught the light again. You smiled. She did not. The brooch, however, almost seemed to. You don't see it at first. That's the point. The chain isn't meant to be seen. It's tucked just beneath the edge of his high collar gold velvet, starched so stiff-like it could probably walk off on its own, and when he turns his head, just slightly, when he leans to whisper something to the man seated beside him, it glints. Only briefly. Only once. Like a secret trying very hard not to get caught. At court, secrets are currency, but mourning is often a liability. You're expected to grieve. Yes, but only in ways that flatter the room. A tasteful tear, a tasteful poem, perhaps a commemorative sigh during dessert. Anything too raw, too honest becomes impolite. Hair, jewelry walks the line. Too visible, and it's seen as performative. Too hidden, and people assume you're ashamed. The chain, then, is a compromise, a quiet declaration, a concealed defiance. He is not a sentimental man. That's his reputation. Cold, efficient, diplomatic in the way Frost is diplomatic with windows. His letters are brief. His compliments are rare and always shaped like legal documents. And yet, he wears the chain. Not around the wrist, not tucked in a pocket around the neck. Close to the throat, where the warmth stays trapped and the scent of someone gone might cling a little longer. You ask a page about it later, one of those jittery boys who carry trays and gossip with equal ease. The page swears it's made from the hair of the man's first love. Not his wife, not his sister. A cousin, perhaps. Or a friend who never got upgraded in the family narrative. They used to ride together, the boy whispers, before either of them knew how important they'd become. The chain was braided, dyed black, and then threaded through a locket clasp that never opens. Not because it's sealed, it just doesn't need to open anymore. The memory inside is finished, so why disturb it? No one's ever seen the full chain. Some believe it's longer than necessary, that it loops twice around the neck, that it brushes the base of his spine, whispering reminders only he can feel. Others say it's short, a choker, almost a thing that presses close like grief that never learned to let go. You watch him during a banquet. He's speaking to someone about taxes, or military appointments, or drought policy. Nothing emotional. Nothing that would hint at longing. But when he lifts his goblet, you see it again, the chain, kissing the collar's edge like a tongue pressed against a locked door. You wonder how many others wear their sorrow this way, neatly hidden. Worn daily, felt in the throat, not the eyes. The banquet ends. He rises. He bows. And as he turns to leave, his collar slipped just a little lower. For a single moment you see it clearly. A clasp. A braid. A memory worn where only the body remembers. The portrait hangs in the West Gallery, just before the corridor narrows into an awkward corner that always smells faintly of damp wool and unswept promises. You pass it without meaning to. The frame isn't particularly grand, and the man it captures seems unbothered by your presence. His gaze does not follow you. He's not one of those haunted eyes types. He looks straight ahead, chin high, mouth closed, like a man still trying to win an argument that ended 3 generations ago. He wears a sash, red, threaded through with something darker, not paint. You step closer. The canvas is cracked near the shoulder, and that's when you see it real material, not pigment. Woven into the canvas, sewn through with care but not ceremony, is a long braid, chestnut brown, slightly coarse, pinned beneath the painted folds of fabric and trailing along the sash's edge like an afterthought that kept insisting on being remembered. No one mentions it on the plaque. It just reads Sir Ulric of Tharn, Marshal, 1673 to 1742, fought at Holdenbrook, lost a hand, kept his temper. You ask the gallery attendant. She blinks, as if you've asked whether the painting is capable of weeping. Then she squints, steps closer, and shrugs. Hair, probably, she says. There's another with thread. This one's less tidy. Could been a trend. Could been a dare. You laugh, mostly to be polite. But you can't stop looking at the sash. You learn more later. From a tattered pamphlet found in a second-hand bookshop that believes in loose stacks and tighter margins, Sir Ulric commissioned the portrait after the war and insisted the braid be stitched in. It belonged to his brother, killed at Holdenbrook, the battle that gave Ulric his title and took half the men he knew. The braid had been in his saddlebag when he returned. No one remembered placing it there. He carried it into every campaign afterward. Not around the wrist, not in a pocket, stitched into a sash he wore under his armour. Always close, always hidden. Until the portrait, when he decided it should be seen not dramatically, not even clearly, but enough for someone to wonder. He wrote in a letter, "If I must be remembered, let it be in the company of someone I failed to save." The sash was real, the braid real, the grief stitched. And now, decades later, it is still hanging just above eye level, just past most people's attention spans. You wonder how many have walked past, thinking only of military medals and noble cheekbones, missing the single thread that mattered most. You stand before it for a while. You tilt your head. You let your eyes adjust. And once you see it, truly see it, you understand that this wasn't about memory displayed. It was about guilt carried. And hair, being what it is, does not forgive easily. But it does hold shape. Long after hands are gone. Long after wars are lost. Long after anyone remembers why. You've seen the portrait. Everyone has. It's the one that hangs above the council stairs, the one every diplomat passes on their way to argue about borders, tariffs, or the proper number of buttons on ceremonial cloaks. Queen Mathilde, seated, spine like a rod of judgment, eyes fixed slightly left of the viewer, as if she could see a mistake before it was made, and had already decided to forgive it once. Her crown is famous, not for its gold, though it had plenty, not for its gems, which were fewer than expected, but for the filigree at the back, what looks, at a distance, like intricate wirework. You wouldn't notice unless you stood beneath the frame and craned your neck at the right angle, which no one does, except the curious or the unusually lost. And if you do, you see it, not metal, not enamel, hair, woven in delicate strands between the loops of gold, braided so finely that even the paint seems uncertain how to capture it. Not decorative, not functional, not even visible unless you were looking for something else entirely. They say it was her daughter's. The girl died during the second summer plague, the one that came with boils and silence. The queen did not weep in public. She did not dress in black. She appeared at court 3 days later in her usual robes, her face unlined, her voice sharp as ever. But when she sat for the portrait 6 months later, she brought the comb, not the child's, her own, the one she had used each morning since the birth. She handed it to the artist without instruction, only said, "Incorporate this." He assumed she meant its shape, but she meant the strands caught in its teeth, months of accumulated memory, clinging in the quiet way that grief prefers. He wove them into the crown, not as a statement, as an inclusion. The queen never acknowledged it, but those who served close began to notice something different. When she spoke of policy, her voice held a weight not tied to governance. When she blessed newborns, she lingered an extra second. And when court celebrations involved music, she often left just before the final dance. Not dramatically, just early. The crown was retired after her reign, placed in a vault, shown only during coronation anniversaries and select museum evenings. But the comb, that vanished. Rumours say she burned it herself. Others say it was buried with the portrait artist, whose hands began to tremble years too soon. One day, you're waiting outside the archives, flipping through a dusty pamphlet on royal fashion symbolism, when a footnote catches your eye. Queen Mathilde's crown filigree, originally thought to be horsehair, later confirmed by analysis to be human, likely unrecorded mourning practice. Uncommon. You smile at the phrasing, uncommon, as if grief ever bothered with being common. You close the pamphlet, and as the clerk calls your name, you glance one last time at the staircase. Her eyes are still looking left, maybe at you, maybe at no one, maybe at a child standing just out of view. You find it in the weapons gallery, which is a terrible place for a button to end up. Swords make sense here. Daggers, certainly. Even the gauntlet embroidered with dried wax and poor decisions fits the mood. But the button, nestled inside a velvet-lined box, feels like someone's mistake, like a misplaced item from the dressing room at Reef. You almost skip it. But then the placard catches your eye. Button worn by Sir Fenton Grey, duelist. 9 recorded victories. One unexplained loss. It's dark, not black, but the kind of brown that looks black in candlelight and chestnut in sun. Smooth, round, rimmed in thin copper. And in the centre, a swirl. At first it seems carved. Then you lean in and realise it's braided. Hair, pressed flat, sealed beneath a layer of resin, locked in place, as if time might someday ask for a refund. It's too small to matter. That's what makes it powerful. They say he wore it during every duel. Not on the chest, but at the wrist. His left cuff. Always visible when he saluted, always tucked back into the sleeve before the blade came out. No one asked. Duelists were not known for their openness. They dealt in skill, speed, and a complex variety of squints. But Fenton was different. He smiled, which was considered impolite in serious matters. He carried a comb in his boot, which was considered eccentric. And he spoke to the button. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just before each duel, a murmur. 3 words, always the same. No one quite caught them. One squire claimed it was wait for me. Another said it was not this time. A third insisted it was just stay in place, which makes no sense unless you've ever been afraid to forget someone. The hair was from his brother, a twin. They'd fought together in the river wars, matching scars like mirrored punctuation. Only Fenton returned. Not whole. Just returned. The braid had been short, the kind taken quickly, while grief is still clumsy. Too short for a ring, not enough for a sash, but just enough for a button. On his final duel, Fenton arrived early. He polished the button more than usual. No witnesses noted who he spoke to beforehand, but they all mentioned the same odd thing: he smiled less. Not less brightly, just less frequently. The duel was clean, fast, sharp. He lost. Not mortally, but significantly. A cut across the forearm, a stumble, a refusal to continue. When asked later why he yielded, he said, "He moved like someone I used to know." The button was removed before the physician arrived. No one confessed to taking it. It turned up decades later in a drawer at the Hall of Martial Accolades, nestled between a cracked belt buckle and a note that read simply, "Some victories stay unfinished." You hold your breath as you look at it, not because it's fragile, but because it isn't. It's not displayed in a gallery. Not even in the private collection room. It lives inside a drawer, behind another drawer, in the sort of cabinet that smells like dust has formed its own opinions. You only see it because the archivist forgets which key fits what and opens the wrong compartment with a soft, embarrassed cough. "Not that one," he says. But of course, now you're interested. It looks like a mirror. Oval, hand-sized, silver frame gone soft with tarnish. The glass slightly warped, the kind of mirror that makes you look a little tired, even when you're not. But what draws your eye isn't the glass. It's the back, braided hair, sewn into the leather casing. Not pressed or hidden, displayed. A circular spiral so tight it must have taken hours, maybe days. Dark brown, almost black, with a thread of silver weaving through like a line of moonlight trying to stay awake. It's not just decorative, it's intentional. And it's unsettling. You ask who it belonged to. The archivist hesitates, then pulls out a record card. One of those stiff pieces of paper stained at the edges with oil from long dead fingers. He reads, squinting. Lady Mess don't know the rest. Possibly Marwick. Possibly Merenhall. He shrugs. There was a Lady M in every generation. You ask what the mirror was for. He shrugs again. For checking yourself, I suppose. Or maybe reminding yourself. The record notes that the hair was her sister's. Died of something quiet. Consumption, someone had written, as if that word explained everything. The mirror was a gift, a posthumous one. The braid was made from the final brushing, the one done after death, when the scalp stops resisting, and the silence feels almost polite. Lady M carried the mirror everywhere. That much is clear from the wear. The handle is smoothed by years of hands. The clasp has a break where it was likely dropped, then repaired with wire and stubbornness. There's a faded scent on the leather lavender old paper, and something sweet but distant, like the idea of sugar more than sugar itself. You ask if she ever married. No, the archivist says, closing the drawer slowly. But then, people didn't always marry for love, did they? You want to ask more. You don't. But before he locks it, you glance one more time at the spiral. Something about the way it coils, not tightly, not chaotically, but with that slow, precise grief that doesn't like to be corrected, stays with you. You think about carrying a mirror like that, looking into it daily, knowing the back holds the only part of someone left that remembers you too. That, when you check your reflection, someone else is already watching. The archivist clears his throat. You thank him. And for the rest of the day, no matter how many times you catch your own reflection in windows, in spoons, in puddles not meant for staring, you find yourself half turning them over, expecting to find hair stitched into the back. You don't carry much when you travel. A coin purse, a cloth to wrap your bread in, a letter you haven't had the courage to send, and now the locket. Small, oval, cool to the touch, even when kept close to the skin. You didn't steal it, exactly. It was left behind in the guest chamber of the inn, tucked into the drawer with the broken handle, the one guests never use, unless they run out of places to hide from themselves. You opened it. Of course you did. You always do. That small hinge is an invitation, and you've never been good with closed things. Inside, hair. A lock, curled deliberately, a soft brown that could be anyone's, except it isn't. You can feel that right away. There's something particular about it, not the colour, not the texture, but the weight. As if the locket carries more than a keepsake. As if it's not a memory you're borrowing, but a presence you've just disturbed. You ask the innkeeper. She shakes her head. No one's been in that room in 3 weeks. You ask the maid. She says it was empty yesterday. She swears. You don't believe them, but you don't press. You tuck the locket into your coat and leave it there. You tell yourself you'll return it when you find the owner. You tell yourself you're just holding it, not keeping it. But each day you travel, it stays with you. Through rain, through market stalls, through the long stretch of road where even your shadow looks tired, the locket never warms up. Even when pressed to your skin, even when you place it in your palm in the sun, even when you wrap it in wool and hope that something will soften, people begin to glance at you oddly. One woman, after sharing a bench with you on a mail coach, asks if you're in mourning. You say no. She points to your collar, where the locket has slipped out, and says, "Then why does it look like you are?" You tuck it away again. You don't answer. That night you dream in strands, threads of hair weaving themselves into shapes you almost recognize, letters, names, places you haven't yet been. When you wake, the pillow smells like lavender. You haven't packed lavender. You begin to talk to the locket. At first you just say hello. Then you apologize. Then, eventually you begin explaining things, what the weather is like, how the bread tasted, what you thought of the road north of Hadley, which isn't really a road so much as an elaborate metaphor for failure carved into mud. The locket never responds. But the hair inside curls slightly tighter each time you look. One day you'll return it. Probably. Maybe. But not today. Today, it sits quietly against your chest, reminding you that grief travels too, and sometimes it hitches a ride with people who have no idea where they're going. You reach it just before closing time. The museum guide had already begun to dim the hallway lamps, walking slowly as if hoping people would leave on their own, without needing to be told. But this case tall, narrow, tucked between a rusted suit of armour and a display of defunct instruments pulls you in. The sign above reads Cabinet of Domestic Sentiments, which sounds like the kind of euphemism used to hide things no one wanted to explain too clearly. The cabinet itself is made of glass and walnut, faintly warped with age. It creaks slightly when someone walks past, even though no one touches it. Inside, dozens of small drawers, each one with a brass handle and a nameplate. And under each nameplate, a lock of hair sealed behind a clear pane like a specimen, or a wish that didn't quite become a prayer. They're arranged alphabetically, or nearly. Someone, long ago, must have had a system. But a few drawers are clearly in the wrong place, Ruth wedged between Elias and Marjorie, Francis floating far from the F's, hovering near Zora like a misplaced comma in a love letter. You pull closer. The labels are handwritten, in ink that has faded just enough to make you squint. Under each name is a date, sometimes a second name, occasionally a phrase, my brother, before the river, or our daughter, with the violets. Some just say from the comb, which sounds practical and devastating in equal measure. You look for patterns. There aren't any. The hair is all colours, some tied with ribbons, some braided into tight coils, one wrapped around a button like a child clinging to a story. One drawer is labelled ME and contains only a single white strand, floating loose like a spider web, refusing to rest. You wonder if these were keepsakes, or if they were surrendered. If the cabinet was a place of honour or of exhaustion. If someone collected these to remember, or to forget properly, because forgetting, after all, takes effort. The docent appears at your shoulder. She doesn't speak for a moment, just stands beside you, looking at the same drawer Tom, aged 9, whistled always. People leave more than they think, she says at last. That's what this place is for. You nod, because you don't know what else to do. She doesn't explain further. She just checks her watch and moves on. You stay. You trace the edges of the glass with one fingertip, careful not to leave a smudge. You find yourself mouthing the names, silently, as if to keep them in the world a few seconds longer, as if reading them again might count as remembering. Before you go, you look for your own name. You don't find it, but there's an empty drawer near the bottom. No label. Just space. Enough for a braid. Or a button. Or a story someone wasn't ready to stop telling. It arrived in a box. Not wrapped. Just a wooden box about the size of a loaf of bread, with hinges that creaked like old knees and a clasp that didn't quite close. There was no note. No wax seal. No signature scrawled in hopeful ink. Just the box waiting quietly on the edge of your stoop, as though it had walked there by itself and gotten too tired to knock. You took it inside with the same hesitation you reserve for strange birds and long-lost cousins. You set it on the table. You waited. Maybe it would vanish. Maybe it would open on its own. It didn't, so you opened it. Inside, hair, not a lock, not a braid, not something soft and sentimental you could cradle with 2 fingers and whisper about in the right lighting. No, this was more. Dozens of strands, looped and gathered and pinned in a delicate spiral, held in place by 4 tiny brass nails, as though someone had built a compass made entirely from grief. In the centre, a pin. Gold. Bent slightly, like it had been worn for too long on too many jackets. You don't recognise the hair. That's the worst part. Not recognising makes it harder, because if you could name the person, if you could say, "Ah yes, my aunt from the mountains," or that one girl who wept at the summer festival and gave me a flower she couldn't pronounce, it would become a keepsake, a tether. Something to explain and fold into a story. But instead, it's just hair. Human, certainly. Tenderly arranged, carefully left, and anonymous. You ask your neighbours. They say nothing's been delivered. You ask the post boy. He shrugs and says he doesn't deliver boxes with feelings. You don't ask again. That night you leave it closed, but the next morning it's open again. No one else has been inside. You stare at it for a while. Then you take the pin from the centre and slide it through the lapel of your coat. It doesn't match anything you own. It doesn't seem to want to, but it stays. And when you catch sight of your reflection in the tea kettle, in a window, in the hesitant glance of a stranger, you look a little more like someone who's remembered something important, even if they can't say what it is yet. Weeks pass. You stop asking where it came from. Instead, you start noticing the ways people look at you differently, not with pity, not with suspicion, but with that slight nod people reserve for shared knowledge, the kind they won't speak aloud but will quietly acknowledge in crowded rooms. The box stays on your shelf, still open, still silent, still full of something you might one day understand or never fully grasp, but wear anyway, because hair lasts longer than memory, and sometimes the gift isn't meant to remind you who you lost. Sometimes it's meant to help you remember who you still are. So now we rest. The names have faded. The braids have frayed. The brooches, buttons, and pins are nestled quietly in drawers no one opens anymore, or tucked beneath portraits that no longer command attention, only dust, and yet something lingers. Maybe it's the scent of lavender that shouldn't still be there. Maybe it's a clasp left fastened too tightly on a coat you forgot you still wore. Maybe it's that feeling in your palm where a locket might sit if your memory had a shape. You've wandered through cabinets and councils, carriages and chapels, pockets and portraits, and through it all hair remained. Not loud, not proud, just there, curling at the edges of grief, braiding itself into routine, catching the light in rooms meant to be serious, and refusing, quite stubbornly, to be forgotten. Thank you for staying with this story until the end. If your eyes are still open, perhaps you're not quite ready to sleep, but that's all right. Tomorrow waits, as it always does, with its shoes in the same corner and its silence just a little out of reach. And this loop we trace through mourning, through memory, through hair and quiet knowing won't disappear. It'll still be there, in the drawer, in the mirror, in you. And you know it will repeat tomorrow, as it always does.